and it's hello to everybody for tonight. As you can see, this is a very, very different show, and it's different for a number of reasons. Of course, you can see I have actually got my official regalia on tonight, because as we know, with the coming of socialism, we will all be queens. But we're also going to have a few technical difficulties tonight, and I hope you bear with us about that. We're going to just keep on and going on with the program, and we're going to start it with this uplifting clip from Liverpool.
It wasn't just a boo against Prince William, but it was a boo because of what it represents, the establishment.
Yeah, the Queen is seen as just another Tory, and I think that that's just another way of getting back at the establishment.
Liverpool people have never sang God Save the Queen. If you look back, they've sang things like God Save Our Gracious Team.
The main chant that's been going up recently at Anfield is fuck the Tories. I mean, that's really common lately, and also one that's been common for a long time. At one point, it was Maggie's in the morgue. Recently, now it's Maggie's in the mud. A lot of the supporters now are wearing fuck the Tories t-shirts. And of course, when Corbyn was around, you know, the Corbyn song was sung from the cop. There were Corbyn banners on the cop. A serious left-wing element in the Liverpool supporters, serious working class background.
You know, that booing, it's almost like a cry, because you see the poverty and the deprivation. Liverpool is festooned with Liverpool FC club. You hardly see any Union Jacks.
It goes back a long way, you know, the hate for the Tories. It probably goes back to the 60s, predominantly on the cop in the 60s. There were a lot of dockers. You know, I started going to Liverpool in the 70s. So even in the 70s, a lot of dockers. The dock strike then, you know, was supported by Liverpool players, and particularly Robbie Fowler and Steve McManaman back in the late 90s.
You know, we've got a history here. There's been lots of cover-ups. Hillsborough was probably one of the biggest cover-ups that we've ever seen, even though all the investigations are over. Nobody was held accountable. In 1911, we had a Liverpool transport workers' strike. There were 100,000 people at St George's Hall protesting. Winston Churchill was the Home Secretary at the time. He ordered troops into the city. He had gunboats ready and waiting to fire on striking workers. There was 2 strikers killed, 2 young fellas killed. We never hear anything about that. That's Liverpool working class history. We hear nothing about that. And it's a little bit like the weekend, what happened in France. We all know that that's going to be another cover-up. So we've had Hillsborough, we've had the 47 councillors, the only council to have stood up against the Tories. We've had Margaret Thatcher, who said she wanted to put Liverpool into a managed decline. And Boris Johnson even said, people play the victim in this city. Well, we don't play anything. We just say it as it is.
Of course, the Republic of Merseyside is famous. English, Scouse not English, another famous saying. And really, the Liverpool supporters don't really support the English team, you know, the England team.
Do you think that was something that the comrade Klopp picked up on? I mean, he seems to be really immersed.
The majority of our supporters are wonderful people, really smart and all these kind of things, understand, go through lows, go through highs, suffer together, all these kind of things. They wouldn't do it if there would not be a reason. That's what I know. And maybe we should ask this question.
You kind of expect managers to fall in with the establishment and give a safe response, but it must have been lovely to hear him backing you up.
Yeah. You know, the statement really was, you need to look further back than just the cup final. And I think it does go back a lot further.
We call ourselves the Republic of Liverpool. It's no accident we haven't got a Tory MP in this city. Liverpool people have got an awful lot in common with the Palestinians and what's going on in Gaza. We've got more affinity with them than we have our own monarchy in this country.
So tonight it's the monarchy. You'll see Jackie and Tina wearing their crowns, but beyond the parody, there are serious issues. And this issue is not for us a distraction. The monarchy is a feudal relic, central to the building and maintenance of the British Empire, a history of extreme violence, murder, class exploitation and racism. And it's a history whose legacy lives on today. The royal prerogative survives for a reason, because it continues the right in emergencies to refuse royal assent to parliamentary bills, dismiss ministers and the Prime Minister, and dissolve Parliament. In the words of Wikipedia, which I looked at today about the royal prerogative, it says this: the monarch remains constitutionally empowered to exercise the royal prerogative against the advice of the Prime Minister or of the Cabinet, but in practice would only do so in emergencies. Well, it has been used in Australia by the Governor General to remove a moderate Labour Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, in 1975. And it could even be used here in extreme crisis for the British ruling class, if ever again there is a left-wing Labour leader. Over to you, Jackie.
Well, and the Jubilee is also very important for a number of other reasons, isn't it? Because here we have an establishment that's really quite embattled. However, strong it may feel as if they are at the moment. In fact, the more they bite, the more you can know that they're on the defensive, as are the monarchy. This transition period between that kind of well-loved maternal or grandmotherly figure of the present Queen and Charles is not going to be an easy one. And this Jubilee has been used to try and sort of make that intersection all right. But actually, we know it's not all right. We know that actually what it represents are all the power structures that as socialists we have to be against. But it's not about the money, not really. It is about who rules and how we're ruled. And of course, it's not just straightforward that republics are better in terms of their figureheads. It's actually more complex than that. But this struggle for who will be the figurehead and what your figurehead stands for is about class war. And that class war was exactly what brought capitalism into power in this country. And John Rees is going to be talking to us about some of the history in terms of how we've ended up with the kind of monarchy we have today.
Welcome to John Rees, who's the author of The Leveller Revolution, Radical Political Organization in England, 1640 to 1650. We were talking in this whole show about the possibility of getting rid of the monarchy. And in this context, it's really important to remember that it's actually a relatively modern invention and that it's changed quite a lot over the centuries. Specifically with John now, we want to look at the year 1649, when King Charles I was beheaded in Whitehall. John, can you explain to us what happened in the period leading up to that beheading and what led to that revolution and the role that the Levellers played in that?
1649 and the execution of Charles I was the culmination of a decade of revolutionary upheaval in this country, at least a decade, beginning with the calling of the Long Parliament in 1640. Charles I had been trying to rule without a parliament for 11 years. He'd locked up his parliamentary opponents from the previous parliament, which had ended in 1629, and he was very reluctant to call first the short parliament and then the long parliament, because he was trying to fight a war with the Scots to impose his version of the Church of England in Scotland. That blew up the political system. As soon as the Long Parliament met, it started passing a series of bills and attacks on the monarchy, which essentially transferred power from the monarchy to the House of Commons. Now, nobody at the beginning of the revolution foresaw either the end of the monarchy or the execution of the king. There was one MP in the Long Parliament at its beginning who could be regarded as a Republican. That was the Leveller ally, Henry Martyn. And when he was walking in Westminster talking to Edward Hyde, another MP who later became the Earl of Clarendon, the key advisor to Charles I, Clarendon asked him what he thought of the monarchy, and Martyn said, no one man is wise enough to rule us all. And Clarendon was so shocked because he'd never heard that sentiment expressed before, and he said, probably rightly, that if it were expressed in public, it would bring opprobrium on the person who voiced such a radical opinion. Even 2 years later, when the Parliament went to war in the Civil War with the King, the Parliament's banners had on it the legend, "For King and Parliament." They were still expressing the idea that the old so-called ancient constitution of king, lords and commons should be the model that needed certainly substantial reform, but not abolition. So it was only really the experience of war that brought some on the parliamentarian side to the view that the king would have to go. The parliamentarians divided during the war into a peace party that really wanted it over as fast as possible. It was a massive disruption to trade. It was calling into question the whole social structure. It was allowing the lower orders to start having a say in politics, and they wanted this finished as fast as possible. And they conducted a series of increasingly desperate peace negotiations with the king to try and do that. The other part of the parliamentarians were the war party, who thought, can't trust Charles, we'll have to fight this through to the end. And those became represented by Martin, who I've mentioned, but also most famously by Oliver Cromwell. And it was Cromwell who first formed a kind of revolutionary armed body among the parliamentarians. Now, Cromwell later on would enter into massive series of negotiations, would praise the monarchy, but during the war, he was definitely part of the war party, the leading military element in the war party, the fight to the finish part of the parliamentarian.
War and revolution go together quite a lot in our history, that war opens up the desire for more from a lot of people.
Yes, I think it's an understudied thing. I mean, it happens in the Russian Revolution, it happens in the Paris Commune, and it both radicalizes but also creates, obviously, an armed force, which isn't what most revolutionaries would choose to be the most democratic element. And certainly in the English Revolution, it's the army which comes to rule. And which is instrumental in crushing the most radical element of the revolution in the Levellers. So it's a kind of Janus-faced development. It enables the revolutionaries to carry through the revolution, but at the same time, it raises an armed power which doesn't necessarily represent the most popular or downtrodden sections of the movement, certainly in the bourgeois revolutions like the English Revolution.
Can you quickly describe then the role of the Levellers and where they got their name from as well?
The Levellers were grouped around illegal printing to start off with. Before they became known as Levellers, they were cooperating together in the production of radical religious and political material from underground presses. They were part of the war party, the radical wing of the parliamentary spectrum during the war. John Lilburn, this is the leader of the Levellers, he went and joined Cromwell in the Eastern Association and really worked as a kind of partner or agent of Cromwell's during the war. When the war finished, the parliamentarian bloc began to fragment. Some of those, like the Levellers, wanted a radical and more democratic solution. Some, like Cromwell, wanted to return to a more traditional form of probably what we would call now constitutional monarchy. The friendship of Lilburn and Cromwell broke apart at this point. The whole project was debated at the Putney debates, where the Levellers brought forward the first ever democratic constitution, written democratic constitution in this country called the Agreement of the People. Their name came from this moment, came from the time of the Putney debates. Some say that it was Charles I that originally called the radicals Levellers. Some say it was Cromwell himself who gave them that name. What exactly they were referring to is also obscure, but it's probably to do with what had been for decades a popular movement to level enclosures, to retain common land by tearing down the fences and hedges that landlords were using to enclose common land. That was called levelling.
Well, so important part of establishing capitalism, wasn't it, to do away with the commons?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And interestingly, in the early 1650s, two of the Levellers, Lilburn and a man called John Wildman, come to cooperate with people who are resisting enclosure in the Fenlands.
Oliver Cromwell, he's got still quite a positive image, I think, even amongst many lefties. You know, he was the anti-monarchy, etc., but he was not really, at the end, as you described, on the side of those who want democracy and equality, and he became like a semi-king himself.
Well, I think the Cromwellian legacy is a divided one. Leon Trotsky said of Oliver Cromwell, better the dead lion of the 17th century than many living dogs, by which he meant Labour MPs, by the way. You have to say about Cromwell that he did see the revolution through. It's his name on the death warrant. It was his, in the end, persistence that saw the end of the monarchy, pushed there by the Levellers. The block between the Levellers and Cromwell that existed during the First War falls apart around the time of the Putney debates, and then is recomposed when it seems as if the king is about to return to the throne. So that block reassembles, and it's because of the last great push of petitioning and activism by the Levellers that pulls Henry Arton first and then Cromwell into the camp of saying, okay, we wanted to do a deal with Charles, but it's just impossible. If he gets back on the throne, we'll all be hung. And we've got to see through the business of purging the moderates from Parliament. That's what Pride's Purge was about, when Colonel Thomas Pride went down to the House of Commons and stopped the moderate MPs entering the House. And then the Rump, as it was called, the remaining MPs, the radicals, saw through the trial and execution of the king. Once that's happened, Cromwell no longer needs the radical left. Mm. And Lilburn's pamphlet, issued just at this moment, the title of it tells you everything you need to know. It was called England's New Chains Discovered. In other words, the new boss is looking very much like the old boss, and he wasn't wrong about that. He and the Levellers were put on trial for treason. He narrowly escaped with his life because the jury wouldn't convict him, and was exiled after that.
The monarchy was still restored a few decades later, 1689, I think. Do you think, though, that this episode, killing Charles I, this revolutionary mood, has that led to restrictions, implications of the monarchy that are lasting to today?
Yes, I mean, the monarchy that was restored in 1660, Charles II, wasn't the monarchy of his father. It was, in all senses, a limited and controlled monarchy. In the intervening period, the period where this country was a republic, one of the first republics, modern republic, the whole apparatus of a modern capitalist state began to be put in place, and the remnants of the monarchy and the aristocracy had no interest in dismantling it. From that moment on, the development of a constitutional monarchy takes place. I mean, obviously it takes some considerable time for it to actually become a constitutional monarchy, but essentially the old attempt to reconstruct the monarchy on absolutist lines, which had been Charles I's project, that project is dead. Mm. And the only project for the monarchy is one which coexists with the new mercantile capitalist powers. Now, of course, they've got no reason to want Levellers or dissenting religion or dissent at all, in fact. So a new kind of ruling class bloc is created by that. Doesn't mean to say that the radical tradition is dead. The radical tradition survives in some very surprising ways. Thomas Jefferson of the American Revolution was distantly related to Lilburn, and in every generation in the Jefferson family, there was a male child with the middle name Lilburn, and the phrase which was first appeared in the Levellers' army paper, the Army Scout, was spoken again by the Leveller Richard Rumbold, who'd been on the scaffold when Charles I was executed, but was himself executed in the 1660s in Edinburgh. His last words were these, and they're as good a summary of the Leveller programme as any. He said, "No man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, and no man booted and spurred to ride him." Well, that level of sentiment turned up as the last words in Thomas Jefferson's diary. When the fathers of the American Revolution visited Britain, the first place they went was the battlefield of Worcester, the last battlefield of the Civil War. And they couldn't understand why the English didn't make more fuss about it. They said, "Don't you understand? This is holy ground." So the influence of the English Revolution spread far and wide. Lunacharsky, the commissar for the Enlightenment in the Russian Revolution, wrote a play about the English Revolution, and the first monument to Gerard Winstanley the Digger was in Moscow.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's very interesting how the rise of capitalism is very closely linked then to the modern monarchy as it exists today. And it's perhaps quite telling that with the crisis of capitalism that we're seeing, the monarchy is also under severe stress at the moment.
Yes, yes, indeed.
John, thank you very, very much for your time.
It's not by coincidence, is it, that our monarchy today is used to go and become merchants of death, selling arms to some of the worst countries in the world. They have always been intrinsically involved in capitalism and in the structures of powers as they are at the moment. Now, I love the way John Rees talked about, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, because so much of what he was saying, I don't know how you feel, was so familiar to what's going on now. We see the monarchy invented, reinvented, and that's the process we're seeing at the moment. Very interestingly, today there was a great article in the Independent, a Black journalist talking about the last 4 days having felt to people who were descendants of slavery, who had the marks of the monarchy burnt into their flesh as a brand to show who ultimately owned them. It's felt like gaslighting. And to talk more about that kind of aspect, I actually did an interview with Dr. Toyin Agbetu, we're going to show you just now. We want a bit of a different perspective is what we're offering people. And I'm going to start with something that I came across quite recently, reading part of a book about the construction of empire. And what it was showing was without the monarchy, it would have been sort of impossible to construct the British Empire as we know it. And I think most people don't understand how intrinsic that was. I mean, how do you see that?
Because empire was very much an engine of violence, of economic exploitation, more than anything else, of course, to racism, etc. But I suppose the monarchy has always been the spiritual engine. It has always been the blueprint. It's always been the mapping. So even like when we hear about things like the Commonwealth, it's still this idea of mapping what empire should look like and actually being the kind of like totem pole for all those troops to go out and kind of like, level violence against innocent people around the world. So empire or the monarchy is central in galvanizing people to do that, sanctioning people to do that. It works, of course, in cohort with the church, which also gives it spiritual blessings on these things, and of course the political elite. But the monarchy is right at the top of that chain because it is the symbolic head.
From a Caribbean perspective, I mean, certainly people of my mother's generation were told to look up at the Queen almost as a sort of maternal, paternal figure. It kind of gave it that soft edge. So they might shoot you and hang you, but somewhere in the distance, there was this monarch. So it gave them a sort of, if you like, a moral authenticity for you to be part of this family in which you were the children and the monarch was the big parent up there.
Similar narratives did run across the continent, Africa. You also hear some things in other regions like Asia. I think in many ways what the British have done, and the monarchy is kind of like central to achieving that, is push this narrative of aspiration, this narrative of greed, of opulence, of seeking to be the most wealthiest, the most powerfulest. And the monarchy represents that. This whole idea that, if you are not the top dog, if you're not, right in charge, if you're not the boss, if you're not flossing the most gold, then somehow you're less than. And this has always been kind of like the narratives, even today, that we hear about what success looks like. It's just so steeped in moral degradation and corruption. You and I are supposed to be subjects of the British monarch. Of course, I reject that. You know, we are officers of empire if we are allegedly kneel before her or them, her agents, and accept their trinkets of dishonor.
And I'm thinking what's happening now in terms of the Commonwealth, the last royal tour to the Caribbean, where I actually think they got a hell of a shock. I presume what happens is that they sit in their palaces and they don't realise the conversations that are happening out there, particularly in different parts of the Commonwealth. What do you think? Do you think it's going to sustain or what?
I think that the feeling of pride that took hold when Barbados became the newest republic last year was infectious. I think it reminded many of those nations of what, you know, independence should truly be. Because remember, I mean, Barbados achieved independence in was it 1966? That's around 55 years ago.
Yeah.
And you know, it's taken all this time for them to become a republic. Jamaica, Belize, I mean, many of those nations, they also have this wound of enslavement, of colonialism. So using Barbados as an example, it was founded in 1654. This was almost 400 years ago. What we're seeing now in the Caribbean is a lot of nations. I heard Gaston Brown, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, he's saying that he intends to become a republic at some stage. Jamaica has always been making those kind of noises, and I think they've got a rocket, you know, kind of up where they need it to kind of do it. Antigua, Barbuda, all of these places are starting to say we have to become republics. It actually means independence, and that means sovereignty. Many of those places have independence, but the level of sovereignty is sorely lacking.
This actually happened in Australia when the Queen actually used her prerogative to change who the Prime Minister was. I mean, these things are, you know, they're not toys, they're actually there. They're written within the function of what the sovereign is. But let's just think about Black people in this country. I think the whole Meghan Markle experience has been very profound for many Black people in this country. What do you think?
I mean, when I see the discrimination that's been taking place, Afrophobia that's rampant in British media, British political elites about Meghan Markle, I think what we're seeing is this fear of a change to what's been centuries of hereditary succession. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha has run throughout the UK since the 1840s, 200 years on. It's kind of like vampires or the Harry Potter series when you talk about muggles and half-bloods, etc. It's kind of like thinking that belongs in a dinosaur era, but actually it's still with us now.
I was very interested in what you were saying about Meghan Markle not being seen as reflecting what the monarchy should be, when in fact her dual heritage and her heritage as having ancestors who were once enslaved people is in fact exactly what the monarchy should be reflecting. What that whole episode revealed was how shallow that liberalness is.
If we look at the one they call Prince Andrew, for example, he has soiled the idea of purity in the royal family. We can go throughout the history of the House of Windsor and what they have done. It was only a couple of years ago when we found out that Buckingham Palace had a cap on the progression of African staff. So they could not progress beyond kind of like servants. This moral degradation is actually already in the bloodline. Trying to preserve something which is actually always rotten at the core, which is always corrupt, is a very strange obsession for me.
You know, especially from people, as you say, who are well known for having affairs here, affairs there. They have this shell of pretense, a moral, elevated status. But we're here to bring them down, aren't we, Toyin?
Well, you know, I just want them out of my life. We heard about the intervention in the Brexit debate, you know, for Brexit, for self-harm. These are ideas that, I think we had to bring those ideas down. I don't really care much about the individuals. Young people recognize that it's a whole load of nonsense, that actually these kind of ideas have to die.
Thanks very much, Toyin. Good to speak to you again.
Likewise, good reviews, all that.
Really important, I think, to be reminded of the fact that it wasn't the whole country who was somehow, entranced by this spectacle. What we actually saw was something like, I think the survey said 54% people in the country said they wouldn't be taking part in anything to do with celebrating the Jubilee. Certainly where I live in London, there was barely a flag up. Glasgow Council refused to do anything. Nothing was happening in Liverpool. Huge swathes of the country did absolutely nothing. And yet their opinions, of course, were not reflected. In fact, even more than that, I actually know somebody who was invited to join the performance celebration, the march that went up. And it was so carefully controlled, just in case somebody said something wrong. So what we saw was extremely performative. And for us, in terms of getting this show together, what we also found, and I'm sure many of you know this, is that there are a lot of people who went away first, and then there were others who were, shall we say, in a public position, who really didn't feel comfortable to say anything publicly. But of course, there were some that did. We had, by the way, a message from Ken Loach, who sent his apologies for not being able to join us tonight, but he gave us a message. He said, in terms of talking about this awful OBE, MBE medal system, which is so obviously now corrupt, with people like Ewan Blair getting his OBE. He sent a message to us about what he did when he was offered one. He said, I didn't do an interview about not accepting the OBE at the time, which was in the late 70s, by the way, because it wasn't asked for. So that's the interesting thing, isn't it? We don't know. It is not told to us how many people really object. Then he goes on, they don't like to acknowledge anyone turns them down. It's part of the propaganda. And then he says, P.S. I just read a quote from Shelley. Monarchy is only the string that ties the robber's bundle. So thank you very much, Ken, for that quote. It's not always easy, is it, to stand up against the establishment? I mean, it takes real guts, doesn't it? Many of us saw that, years ago, Starmer made that stand against the monarchy, didn't he? Brave man. Well, let's see Starmer and what he's doing today.
Well, the UK has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. He dedicated his life to our country. And above all, I think he'll be remembered for his support and devotion to the Queen. And all of our thoughts are with the Queen, the royal family, and the British public as they come together to mourn this huge loss.
I also got made a Queen's Counsel, which is odd, since I often used to propose the abolition of the monarchy.
Wonderful man, isn't he? I mean, just, that's the kind of leader that we want, isn't it? One who can just change his mind, just, when it suits him. So pretty incredible there, isn't it, Graham?
Well, it isn't really, I'm afraid. It's nauseating, but this is in line with so much of Labour's history of support for monarchy and empire. And in fact, it's people like comrades like Keir Hardie, Tony Benn, and Jeremy Corbyn. These are the honourable exceptions. Benn and Corbyn moved the Commonwealth of Britain Bill in 1991, proposing 1, the abolition of monarchy and the constitutional status of the Crown, 2, the functions of the royal prerogative to be transferred to Parliament, 3, the abolition of the House of Lords, and 4, the disestablishment of the Church of England. But these were the exceptions. The party was founded as a class compromise based on the political representation of Labour, but always within the economic limits of the rule of capital and the political limits of operating within the existing British Constitution of Parliament and monarchy. As Herbert Morrison, a key member of Attlee's 45 Labour government, so graphically put it, Labour are great friends of the jolly old empire, and we're going to stick to it. And this, I'm afraid, is the history of our party. And it's comrades like Jeremy and Tony and others who were the exceptions and whose legacy we must fight for, because their views, I think, represent certainly now the majority of party members, even as reduced, even as suspended, and even as expelled. They represent our views on monarchy, not the Starmers. So it's nauseating, but I expect no different.
Well, I'll tell you something, as long as I'm allowed to wear a crown to lunch, which is what I did today, I'll be quite happy with that. But in fact, we know that Jeremy had some thoughts when he was leader of having a look at how to deal with constitutional matters like the Queen.
Welcome to Pauline Bryant. You're part of the Red Paper Collective, a group of Labour activists who aim to provide an alternative from the perspective of the Labour movement to what you call the sterile nationalist versus unionist debate around the Scottish independence referendums. You're also a founding member of the Keir Hardie Society, and you were an editor of the book, What Would Keir Hardie Say? And you're also a founding member of the Campaign for Socialism. So, Pauline, in 2019, Jeremy Corbyn designated you the lead for updating the party's policy on federalism and reform of the House of Lords, the election of the second chamber. Jeremy Corbyn is clearly no monarchist. Why do you think, did you not call for the abolition of the House of Lords and monarchy, as was Keir Hardie's programme?
Absolutely, yes. I would call it the abolition of the House of Lords and then a new second chamber. So I would have no problem with the term abolishing. It's one I use all the time. The reason we need perhaps a second chamber is more apparent now than in Keir Hardie's time, partly because the quantity of legislation that actually passes through the House of Commons, much of which just isn't scrutinised. It is a very, very centralised way of running our government. Best way of putting it is government by an executive, but at the moment it appears to be government by a prime minister. The Tories have a large majority, there's very little scrutiny, and we have an ineffective opposition, so there's no scrutiny coming from there. To have any checks and balances on that sort of really centralised way of legislating, I think there is a role for a second chamber. The question is how it gets there. And what we've proposed under the invitation of Jeremy Corbyn is for a Senate of the nations and regions. So people end up in the second chamber, they're elected, but it's not a replica of the House of Commons. You might also want to look at how the House of Commons is elected, but that's a separate issue. And what I'm absolutely opposed to, which I think will be a proposal that does come up, that you have a second chamber made up with representatives of the great and the good, the clever people who are part of an elite, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, military, trade union leaders, but they are the establishment. We've got to find a way of having a second chamber that reflects people's lives as they live them on a daily basis.
Can I ask, when an MP is elected in Scotland, doesn't he represent Scottish, his constituency there? Why do we need another, there is a problem perhaps sometimes with two chambers that they cancel each other out, etc.
I would give it different responsibilities. I think the whole point is that our constitution has changed, but that hasn't been addressed. That we do have the equivalent of four parliaments: the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Synod, we have the Northern Ireland Assembly. England is somehow represented in Westminster. Government ministers have responsibility for England. That needs to acknowledge that things have changed completely. We never finished the process of devolution. Having an opportunity for those four interests to come together. We live in such an asymmetrical relationship with England. A report was prepared. It's never actually been presented to Keir Starmer. He has it, whether he's read it or not, I have no idea whether anyone's read it. It's an issue that just comes up from time to time. Thought is given to it, reports are written, they're put away in a filing cabinet and that. I mean, we have had the abolition of the House of Lords in the manifesto since 2015 under Ed Miliband. There is, I think, a broad level of agreement that something has to change.
What was the Commission's ideas on the monarchy then? Are you in favour of abolishing it?
It wasn't part of the remit, and I think there is a reluctance to tackle that head on. And to be honest, I wouldn't make it a priority. I would always argue that the monarchy is totally unacceptable and that it should never have a place in our society, any inherited position of that sort.
In 1991, Jeremy Corbyn seconded the Commonwealth Bill by Tony Benn, which did include the abolition of the monarchy, votes from 16, etc., etc. Have you been looking at that bill from 1991?
It's always referred to. Some people, including perhaps Jeremy himself, think you can take it off the peg and just apply it now. It's not as simple as that because things have changed. The underlying principles of it are the same. To get rid of the hereditary nature of the House of Lords, the representation of the Church of England, which is still, when you think such an incredible thing to have in your legislature. This is what other countries are accused of, religious leaders having too much power. The underlying principles of Ben's bill still apply. I just think that the role of the second chamber needs to take account of what he didn't have to deal with, which was the devolved parliament.
Imagine Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister. We know there were plans being made to deal with that on all sorts of levels. The army generals were declaring they would mutiny, etc. I mean, the Queen has previously got rid of prime ministers in Australia. She used the royal prerogative to do that. Could you imagine a similar situation could have happened in Britain?
That's an interesting thought. I think the media, the army, aspects of the civil service, I think would have felt that from their perspective, they wouldn't have let it go. And we'd seen it previously with Tony Benn. The establishment can churn out so much vile comments and information, they would try to destroy people. So I think that yes, I think there would have been some reaction. I've no idea what the Queen would do. I mean, her whole background, her family was steeped in right-wing politics. So I assume some of that must rub off on them.
Tina mentioned earlier on me as the president of the Keir Hardie Society. I just want to read you from Keir Hardie that the throne represents the power of caste, of class rule. In this country, loyalty to the Queen is used by the profit mongers to blind the eyes of the people. We can have but one feeling in the matter, contempt for thrones and for all those who bolster them up. I just wonder, where do you see the politics of republicanism? How can socialists encourage and build that kind of politics?
I mean, it's a question that I think has been around all my political life. One thing is, I think, becoming clearer is that younger people are less enamoured of the monarchy. Maybe that's just been a cycle that has gone round, and as people get older, somehow it becomes more acceptable to them. Because the monarchy itself is in transition, there will be less respect for it, less belief that it's a natural occurrence and can't be changed. They're adaptable, they can change. Until such a time there is an outcry, I think that's going to come sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much for joining us, especially because you're feeling poorly. Let's hope you
thank you,
feel soon.
Okay,
good. We also know, as was just said, that in particular younger people are very much disinterested in the monarchy. So I think we are at that tipping point where it's going to be very interesting to see whether Charles can sustain the monarchy, and watch this space, because I think that change will be coming about quite soon. Don't forget, please, to contribute to Patreon if you want us to carry on. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. Sorry about the technical difficulties. When you're on a shoestring, which is like what we are, it's very hard for the operation to still go forward. Graham's going to now tell us about the next show.
Well, Red Line briefing TV doesn't dodge difficult issues, as we know. A month ago, we tackled the trans issue, and on the way, we made a number of friends and a few critics too. So our next two programs are on the subject of liberating the Holocausts, on the Jewish Holocaust, on the African Holocaust, and others too. It will be challenging and informative and interesting, with a lot of speakers being planned for these two programs. I look forward to seeing you in a fortnight. This could be important. At least I can say, and I hope to be speaking on this, that at least I don't fear expulsion from the Labour Party. Thank you, comrades.
It's going to be an amazing two programs, really. Watch it, come see us, and good night to everyone. See you in a couple of weeks' time.